Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 21st of May 2022. The articles which we shall cover today have been displayed on your screen, and so let's now quickly delve into the discussion. The first article which we have taken has appeared on page number 8 on editorial page, The Neighborhood in Turmoil Lessons for India, which talks about 5 neighboring countries, namely Myanmar, Nepal, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, going through non-electoral changes at the top. Now if you look at all these countries in past 2 to 3 years, they have gone through the changes at the top. When we talk about Afghanistan, the hostile takeover of Taliban. Moving east from Afghanistan is Pakistan, and we recently saw in last 2 to 3 months how, due to the military or establishment interference, Imran Khan was forced out of the power and Shahbaz Sharif was made the Prime Minister. Then if you move a little bit south, you have Sri Lanka, which is going through extreme turmoil to the extent that current family which rules Sri Lanka, or which has ruled Sri Lanka until very recently, has to fled their residences. And then finally you have Myanmar, where democratically elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi was removed by military junta. And if you look at GS Paper 2 International Relations syllabus, India and its neighborhood relations is a part of your syllabus. And of course how India's relationships with its neighbors is evolving depends upon, to a large extent, on who is ruling that country. So in the past, when the neighborhood went through these changes, India had certain policies, but because of exactly those policies, India has learnt its lessons. And so what are those lessons which India has learnt in past 5 to 10 years, which India is choosing to apply now? But there are certain other lessons which India needs to learn in order to be more mature towards how it handles its own internal politics and how it chooses to engage with its neighbors, is the topic of today's editorial, which we are going to understand. Let's now begin the discussion. So if you're following the current affairs, you must be knowing that in last 5 to 6 years, 5 countries in India's neighborhood, for example Myanmar, Nepal, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, have undergone non-electoral changes at the top. So the political changes in these 5 nations have been brought not as a result of electoral process, but by other means. For example, the power takeover by the army in Myanmar, acquisition of power by force in Afghanistan, and similarly in Nepal, Sri Lanka. And so what are the key lessons which have been learnt by the government of India? And the first key lesson which we can clearly point out is that for the first time in many decades, New Delhi has not been held responsible in any of its neighboring capitals for attempting to interfere in their political process. And if you just look at your screen, you can realize that when these political changes occurred last time, New Delhi was held responsible in a big way. But not this time. You're not going to see media headings like these in the current change of power in these countries. Then when it comes to the relationship with the newly established power or political entities in these countries, the government of India has abandoned one-size-fits-all policy. Earlier, India used to decide whether it wants to interact with a particular nation or not on the basis of how these powers have been elected. So generally, India never interacted with the earlier military junta or the rulers of Myanmar because of the very fact that they were not elected via transparent democratic process. But if you see India's current policies, that is not the guiding light, that is not the principle which is guiding India's foreign policy. And the best case demonstration is what has happened in Myanmar and what has happened with Afghanistan. While in Myanmar, the Modi government continued engagement and even strengthened ties with the military junta that overthrew the government led by Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy. In Afghanistan, the government of India severed ties with Taliban that took power in Kabul by force after Afghan President Ashraf Ghani left the country. Not just that, in Nepal, where Prime Minister Sher Bahadur Deuba came to power after the Supreme Court dismissed KP Oli, and in Sri Lanka, where public protest forced Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa to appoint rival and opposition leader Ranil Wickremesinghe as the Prime Minister, New Delhi has been largely supportive of the process. But when it came to Pakistan, India has virtually ignored the swearing in of Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif after Imran Khan lost the vote of confidence. The lessons which India has learnt are not just limited to New Delhi not being held responsible for the change of power or one size fits all model being abandoned, but India has also starkly moved away from its earlier policy of rhetoric on domestic issues, and that is a big lesson which India has learnt recently. For example, when Parliament enacted Citizenship Act 2019, the government of India was extremely vocal about what is happening in Bangladesh and Pakistan. But the rhetoric has been toned down much. The government's public reaction to Durga Puja violence against Bangladesh's Hindu minority last year was much more nuanced than its messaging during the push ahead of Citizenship Amendment Act 2019. Apart from that, India seems to have learned the lesson that messaging has to be addressed to the people rather than people in power. And the best case demonstration was the efforts made by Modi government to involve itself into careful negotiation with Pakistani officials to ensure it could send around 50,000 metric ton of wheat meant for Afghan people, despite the fact that it has no diplomatic engagement with either Islamabad or Kabul. And this is a big deal. It shows the extent to which the New Delhi is willing to walk to help the people in India's neighborhood. And these are the 4 sets of lessons which the author believes that the government of India has learned. But there are a lot of lessons which still need to be learned, and it is important for us to have a look at them as well. There are particularly 3. Populism does not pay in long term. Popularity of leaders can decline very sharply in a very small amount of time, and it's the economy which rules. Let's understand them one by one. And so the first lesson, according to the author, that is yet to be learned is that populism does not pay in the long run. Now, all those people who do not understand what populism means, it is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. It is basically an idea that tries to make a difference between common people and elites. Populists may think of wealthy people or very well-educated people as belonging to the class of elites. And we have seen a recent trend across the globe where populist leaders are making very good electoral moves, not just in South Asia, but also in South America, as well as in Europe. And so this is a current global trend. Now let's take a while to also understand the relation between corruption, social inequality, which gives rise to popular disenchantment, which results in populism. So as you can see in this vicious cycle, public money is squandered or diverted or wasted to serve the interests of the rich. The system is rigged. People do not feel that they can change it, and because of which there is an increase in the social inequality in the system. This increase in the social inequality in the system results into the privileged class who benefit from the current status quo. They have the power and incentives to corrupt the system and maintain their privileges perpetually, which then gives rise to systemic corruption, and this vicious cycle continues. Because of which citizens experience the system as rigged and do not think the stable is able to address inequality and exclusion, which then generates massive amount of popular disenchantment, which is then harnessed or harvested by populist leaders. Citizens support populist candidates due to their appeal to break this vicious cycle of corruption led by elites of the society. So according to the author, while the combination of hyper-nationalism, religious majoritarianism, and populism can bring the men of the masses, such as Mahinda Rajapaksa, KP Oli, Imran Khan, to power, because of the very reason that they promise an alternative to corrupt nepotistic dynastic regimes, it does not necessarily keep them there, and within no matter of time they are removed from the power. And it is a mistake of any government to conflate or confuse an electoral win and a mandate for governance with clear instruction to rule the country as they may like. It's not true. And the second important reason, whenever the government of India tries to interact with its neighborhood, they should recall that popularity of leaders can decline very sharply in no amount of time. KP Oli won a landslide victory in 2017, where his 6 alliance secured majorities in both houses and formed governments in 6 of the 7 provinces, is no more in power 3 years. is no more in power 4 years down the line. Similarly, Imran Khan won all 5 National Assembly seats he fought in 2018 elections. And while his party did not win a majority of seats, it won the popular vote. Rajapaksas, all the brothers of the Sri Lanka's People's Party ruling coalition, won 150 of 225 parliamentary seats in 2020. And 1.5 years down the line, they have been removed from the power. And that these popular mandates could be cast aside in just a few years is a stark reminder that nothing is forever, especially in a democracy. And at the same time, we should also recall that the leaders who replaced the earlier ones may not be as charismatic as the ones they are replacing, but they were acceptable both domestically and internationally. And then finally, the last lesson which India has to learn is economy rules. In Pakistan, Nepal and Sri Lanka, the defeat of these populists has come not as much as the hands of opposition parties, but by slowdown in growth, increasing unemployment or reducing jobs, and very high rate of inflation. We have seen that in past 2 years, COVID-19 pandemic enforced lockdowns have been pervasive across the globe, especially in South Asia. And more recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sanctions by West have made food and fuel prices soar. And so in such a situation, the change in power in these countries took only a small push, either from the military or from the courts, or in case of Sri Lanka, from street protests. And so in such a scenario, given the common challenges of the region, New Delhi must find newer ways to energize regional groupings such as BIMSTEC, BBIN, and even to reconsider SAARC in order to discuss shared approaches to revive tourism exports and supporting South Asian expatriate labor abroad and building common pools of food and fuel stocks to soften inflationary pressures on South Asian economies. The next news which we have taken has appeared on page number 10. Welfare schemes should reach every beneficiary, urges Modi. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in his virtual address at a meeting of his party members, spoke about reaching a saturation point in implementation of welfare schemes of his government. The saturation point, he said, must not only be a statistical aim. When we talk about saturation, our aim must be to free the country from the clutches of discrimination, nepotism, appeasement and corruption. So this clearly highlights one of the biggest problems which India's social sector faces, and that is given in your GS paper 2 syllabus: welfare schemes for vulnerable sections of population by center and states and performance of these schemes. Now under this section, you have to prepare a lot of individual schemes. You have to prepare their features, their objectives, their issues independently, and it is a must for flagship schemes. But there are certain issues or the challenges which mar each and every, which is faced by each and every social sector scheme. And it is important for you to understand what those challenges are. And so in this discussion, we are going to understand the common challenges and the steps which have been taken by the government to resolve those issues under the welfare schemes. Let's now begin the discussion. Alright, so beginning the discussion by first understanding the challenges, starting with beneficiary identification. As we all know that almost all the welfare schemes, most of them have a target beneficiary. For example, midday meal scheme is for the school kids. MG Narega is for people who are unemployment and they are looking for unskilled 100 days of guaranteed employment. But welfare schemes often fail to target the intended beneficiaries due to several inclusion as well as exclusion error. So inclusion error means that a lot of people are getting the benefit of a particular scheme who should not be getting. For example, people belonging to above poverty line group getting free food. They are not the intended beneficiary of targeted PDS or TPDS, but still they are getting it, and that is called as inclusion error. At the same time, there has been a lot of exclusion error in the welfare schemes that our country is running. Now, exclusion error means that a lot of people who should be getting the benefit are not being able to get the benefit. They're not able to derive the benefit out of these welfare schemes, and that is a problem because they are the ones who should be getting it to start with. At the same time, we know that the status of beneficiary is dynamic concept. For example, if a person is today below poverty line located here, might be able to cross the poverty line in some time and should not be ideally getting the benefits of the free food. And so the aim of social protection is to ensure that a person comes out of below poverty line at some point of time. But absence of continuous evaluation of schemes and their beneficiaries results in providing benefits to unintended beneficiaries, and which is one of the biggest challenge which our welfare schemes are facing. Then of course, we have the issues of corruption and leakages. So on the one hand, these programs have helped to alleviate poverty and benefit many. Most of the programs are mired with leakages and corruption, and mainly because of lack of scrutiny and awareness, weak enforcement of laws that has led to a sense of fearlessness among India's corrupts, lack of political action or political inaction. Most of the time, officials involved in corruption have political backing. Many times politicians or their family members themselves are involved in corruption. And centralized administration. We know that all welfare schemes, most of them are deeply centralized. That comes at the cost of building a local government system that is genuinely and truly responsive to citizens' needs. Then we have seen in the past that while evaluating the success or the failure of a particular welfare schemes, the focus of the government has always been on outputs rather than on outcomes. Which basically means that the focus or the emphasis has always been to highlight the direct and measurable product of program activities, which can be often expressed in physical terms. For example, the government would often tell you how much of expenditure was incurred, let's say in skill development scheme, but they are never going to tell you how many people were actually skilled and got the job, got employed as a result of this welfare scheme. Because outcomes are the collective results or qualitative improvements brought about by the delivery of these schemes. So government might tell you the data of the toilets built under the Swachh Bharat mission, but how many people were nudged to shun the open defecation is something which is not measured, and that is what should be measured, because outputs are very easy, but outcomes are very difficult. The true realization of the full potential of these welfare schemes will be achieved only when we focus on outcomes rather than outputs. Then not on everything we can blame the government, because there are a lot of demand side issues as well. Demand side issues means the issues, lack of awareness on behalf of the citizens, their lack of enthusiasm to participate in the decision making is also one of the reasons which pose biggest challenges to the implementation of the welfare schemes. Demand driven and rights based welfare schemes like PDS or Manrega can't be implemented efficiently without the awareness and full participation of the people. And this lack of awareness reduces the vulnerable sections to mere beneficiaries rather than the partners in the development process. And this is important to realize that there is a big difference between when people act as partner in the development process as opposed to just the receiving and passive recipients of the development schemes. When they behave as partner, they not only benefit from it, but their feedbacks also tend to modify these welfare schemes. Whereas beneficiary is just a passive recipient having nothing to do with the implementation of the scheme, and hence when something goes wrong, there is no one to tell it to the government, no pressure group, no activity, nothing to stop the corruption, to stop the inclusion and exclusion error, to stop the political inaction, for which they need to act like partners. Then apart from this, some welfare schemes are supposed to be temporary in nature till the structural issues are resolved. But more often than not, these populist welfare schemes become an end in themselves. For example, Manrega was introduced to arrest distress migration of rural people by assuring livelihood to them. However, Manrega scheme provides majorly unskilled manual work. It has neither resulted into any kind of permanent skill development in rural youth, nor has it led to creation of permanent qualitative assets. So both of these objectives have not been met. And so the likelihood of Manrega benefiting the rural society in long term in terms of sustainable employment opportunities is nowhere near the horizon. And then there is also a thought that these welfare schemes may hinder the capacity building. Unlimited welfare schemes may disincentivize the beneficiaries to improve their capabilities and make them reliant upon government benefits perpetually. So it's not like Government of India has not taken any steps to counter these challenges. Of course, government has. The government has brought in a lot of reforms for better targeting of these schemes, and the first step in that direction was socio-economic caste census that was conducted to replace the old below poverty line or BPL list to identify the potential beneficiaries of the government schemes. Aadhaar was enacted by the government to provide unique identity and to be useful in targeting the intended beneficiaries. Then we have seen direct benefit transfer and its increasing use in enabling the beneficiaries to avail these welfare schemes. DBTs are introduced to ensure correct funds are transferred to the correct beneficiary, reducing corruption and leakages in the system. And the government has drastically improved on this parameter. Then the government has incrementally started using the technology in the welfare schemes. For example, GeoManrega uses space technology to develop a database of assets created under Manrega using technological interventions like mobile-based photo geotagging and GIS-based information system for online recording and monitoring. The entire database is in public domain and ensures transparency and full public disclosure. Then in the recent years, the government has tried to institutionalize the process of self-help groups in developmental process. SHGs are roped in to implement and monitor schemes like NRLM or National Rural Livelihood Mission to increase transparency and awareness of the beneficiaries about their entitlements. And this is one of the biggest benefits of involving SHGs in welfare schemes. People's participation not only ensure transparency, but it also ensures that there is a demand from the people's side. And then finally, outcome-based budgeting, which is a method of budgeting that measures the progress of each department and ministry and what they have done with its allocated budget. As we have seen, this has been one of the issues because the focus has always been on outputs and not on outcomes, but now the government has tried to institutionalize the outcome-based budgeting. The next article for discussion is Timely Reminder, which has appeared as a column on page number 6. The center should be more conciliatory towards states' fiscal dilemmas and GST concerns. So pronouncing its verdict on a protracted dispute over the levy of GST or goods and services tax on ocean freight charges paid by importers, the Supreme Court on Thursday held that such a tax was untenable. Its 153-page judgment has also dwelt at length on the nature of recommendation of the GST Council, which is the constitutional body set up to oversee the operations of indirect tax regime. While this article deals specifically with the GST and talks about its impact on fiscal federalism and hence finally on federalism, what we are observing is various trends which are straining the ties between center and states, not just in legislative or executive matters but also in fiscal matters. Whether we talk about increasing share or proportion of cess and surcharges in the gross tax revenues which do not become the part of the divisible pool, or lack of GST compensation cess from the behalf of the central government to the states, or increasing role of centrally sponsored schemes in overall wealth horizon, or limiting the powers of the states to borrow from the market. All of them are trends which indicate towards increasing centralization of the financial resources of our country. Now, if you wonder why is it important for our syllabus, under GS paper 3, that is economy, Indian economy and issues related to planning and mobilization of resources is a part of your syllabus. And all these 4 matters which we have talked about is nothing but mobilization of the resources by the center and by the states. Apart from that, even in GS paper 2, this aspect gets covered under issues and challenges pertaining to the federal structure of the country. And so we are going to learn 4 important aspects, 4 important domains under which India is observing constrained ties between center and state. So as we know that federalism, which is the constitutional division of power, not only extends to legislative or lawmaking matters or administrative or executive matters, but it also extends to fiscal matters, which ensures autonomy for the states to raise revenues and undertake expenditure according to their priorities and needs. Such form of fiscal federalism has been formulated keeping in mind the diverse needs and aspirations of the states across India and hence considered critical for balanced and holistic development of the entire country. There have been few developments in the recent past because of which it seems that the fiscal federalism has skewed towards the center in certain aspects, and the same has been opposed by a number of states. In this regard, let us understand some important issues which have arisen in the center-state fiscal relations, starting with higher share of cess and surcharges. As we all know that cess and surcharges imposed and collected by the center do not form the part of central divisible pool, and because of which they are not distributable among the states and hence continue to remain with the center. Over a period of time, the center has been imposing large number of surcharge and cess to mobilize revenues. A case in point is the recent introduction of agri-infrastructure cess in Union Budget 2021-2022. And not to anyone's surprise, the share of these cess and surcharges has increased as a percentage of gross tax revenue of the center from 2.3% in 80-81 to 15% in 2019 and 20. While they are seen as an important source of revenue for the center, they are seen as an illegitimate way of depriving resources that are rightfully belonging to the states. Then apart from this, the raging issue of GST compensation cess. States agreed to give up the powers to impose indirect taxes and adopt GST based on guaranteed 14% growth in GST revenues per annum. The center committed to pay the states for the shortfall in their GST revenue through the imposition of GST compensation cess for a period of around 5 years. However, on account of COVID-19 pandemic, there was a GST shortfall of almost around 3.65 lakh crores. Hence, there was an obligation on the center to pay compensation amount of almost 2.35 lakh crores. Initially, the center asked the states to borrow this amount from the market, but later on, due to strong opposition, the center decided to borrow on behalf of the states and compensate them for the same. This recent issue over GST compensation has led to erosion of trust in the fiscal federalism. Then the issue does not end over there. We have the perpetual issue of centrally sponsored schemes, which are the schemes which are financed by both state and center. The proportion in which they are to be financed by the state and center respectively could vary from 70-30, 60-40 to some cases 50-50 as well. But they are implemented ultimately by the states. Now some of these schemes include Manrega, Ayushman Bharat, National Education Mission. Now the problem is that the center lays down elaborate rules and regulations with respect to the implementation of these schemes. It lays down the purposes for which the funds can be utilized for. The state governments claim that such rules and guidelines do not provide them with enough financial and operational autonomy in execution of these schemes. The problem is that central decides the objective, central decides the way they are going to be implemented, but mandates the states to incur a fixed proportion of the expenditure, which is again a dent on the state revenues. Because each and every state might have their own agenda, might have their own priorities, but the priorities are often set by the center for each and every state government. Then one of the most important issues which the center-state relation face is related to Article 293, which deals with the borrowing power of the states. We know that states are allowed to raise loans from the center or from the market. However, a state cannot raise a public loan without the consent of the center if there is still an outstanding on any part of a loan. So for example, if state governments have borrowed from the center which they have not repaid, they will have to take the permission of the central government to borrow further from the market. Since all the state governments have been and continue to be indebted to the center effectively controls the amount of public debt which can be raised by the state governments. In recent times, particularly in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, frictions have arisen over the center's attempt to perpetually control borrowings by the states. The recent 50-year interest-free loan announced by the center for the states is a case in point. Any state which avails the facility will need to take center's permission for all future borrowings at least for the next 50 years. So these are some of the issues with respect to the fiscal federalism in our country. Now it remains to be seen what and how government is going to resolve these issues. So the last article which we have taken for today's discussion is a very important one. Talking peace, negotiating with Maoists. Despite past experience and specific conditions, the Chhattisgarh government and the Maoists can work out a plan is an article which has been written by IPS R.K. Vij, who is also a former special DGP of Chhattisgarh. This article throws lights on the problem of Maoists or Naxalism in India's hinterland, in India's central place. It traces the history of the Naxalism, how they have evolved, why the government has not been able to talk them out of the violence. Already GS paper 3 has a line which says linkages between development and spread of extremism. Now, more often than not, left-wing extremism or Naxalism is seen associated with the lack of development. And so this is the first thing which you get in form of violent resurrection of the society. If we talk about the MHA, Ministry of Home Affairs, which is responsible for the internal security in our country, it has categorized 4 issues related to internal security in our country. Terrorism in the hinterland, left-wing extremism in certain areas, security situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and insurgency in northeastern states. And so in this particular discussion, we are going to keep ourselves focused on left-wing extremism in certain areas, which is around 1/4 of the total internal security related challenges which India faces in present context. UPSC asked, the persisting drives of the government for development of large industry in backward areas have resulted in isolating the tribal population and the farmers who face multiple displacements with Malkangiri and Naxalbari foci. Discuss the corrective strategies needed to win the left-wing extremism doctrine affected citizens back into the mainstream of social and economic growth. Similarly, left-wing extremism is showing a downward trend but still affects many parts of the country. Briefly explain the Government of India's approach to counter the challenges posed by LWE extremism. So you can see that not just as a part of syllabus, but also as a part of previous year question, this topic is very important. So we are going to start our discussion by first understanding the ideology of Naxalism. Then we are going to deal into the challenges because of which, or the lacunas because of which, this ideology has taken root in large areas of our country. And then finally we are going to understand the government's approach to tackle the problem of Naxalism in our country. Let us now begin the discussion. Starting with understanding what Naxalism actually is. So Naxalism is a far left violent movement which aims to overthrow the government of India through people's war. So it basically wants to replace the Indian state through a violent and a guerrilla movement. According to the recent MHA release, it is currently impacting more than 80 districts scattered around 11 states in our country. So you can easily understand how widespread the spread of Naxalism is. Although it has decreased through time, but it is still prevalent in many areas. If we talk about Naxalism, from where does this word comes from? It comes from a village known by the name of Naxalbari in Darjeeling district of West Bengal. Because this whole movement is derived from there. Because in 1967, peasant revolt against landlords in Naxalbari village in Darjeeling district of West Bengal went out of control and police opened fire on them, and there began this violent movement which actually claims to base its ideology on 3 important people. First is Marx and Engels, and the second is Mao Zedong. Now if we talk about left or far left movement, most of them derive their ideology from the same set of people, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So what was their actual ideology? So according to them, all social relations and state structures in an elitist or a capitalist society are quite exploitative in nature. And since they are exploitative in nature, they need to be replaced. And so according to Naxals, the current Indian state is based on similar capitalistic or semi-feudal setup. And so it needs to be replaced. But there are various ways of replacing a government or a state, but they talk about a revolution. Only a revolution can change this exploitative setup. And so, whoever bases his or her ideology on Marx believes that only a revolutionary change through active means can end this. And that means is provided by Mao Zedong, who led the revolution of Communist Party in China, because he gave the concept of guerrilla warfare, protracted people's war, a war led by the common people against the state, the war not in democratic sense, but war which is violent in nature, which includes surrounding the cities from countryside, political transformation through mass involvement, and finally, through these measures, overthrow the state. And so Naxalites base their ideology on these 2 things. And so whenever you read news articles related to some Naxalite activity, they basically deal with attack on prominent political leaders, paramilitary forces and police personnel because they want to overthrow the Indian state. But what is the reality of Naxalites? If you look at their overall activity, it seems to be that they are working against the interests of the people they claim to defend. They want to perpetuate their power in jungles through fear psychosis. They attack civilians and personnel from CAPF or Central Armed Police Forces. They carry out regular extortions, not just from the local people but also from industrialists. So although they claim to base their ideology on Marx and against capitalism, but they let the industries thrive as long as they agree to pay protection or extortion money. And so the question arises that under the constitutional and legal framework of India, which is considered to be one of the most democratic setup, how come an ideology like Naxalite not only emerged but spread into such a vast territory in our country, as you can see on the diagram in front of your screen? At its peak, it impacted so many districts and states in our country. An answer to that lies in government deficit, the inability or inefficiency of the government to cater to the needs and demands of the people, especially the tribal people, created a fertile ground for this kind of ideology, which ultimately engulfed a major region in our central parts of country. And let us understand those reasons one by one. But basically they can be categorized into four main reasons. Starting with lack of proper land reforms, lack of proper implementation of the provisions provided in the 5th schedule of our constitution, lack of forest rights being given to the tribal people, and atrocities being committed against people belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Let us discuss them one by one. We know that the Constitution of India has created the provisions of the 5th schedule, which provide for alternate or special governance mechanism for certain scheduled areas in the mainland of our country. And in the 5th schedule, various special provisions have been provided for these specified scheduled areas, which among various other things include the constitution of Tribal Advisory Council in the states. And it also provides for some special powers being given to governor with respect to the legislations. Now this provision was created in order to protect the tribals in various states. But what has happened? What has happened is that there is a widespread nepotism in the way tribal advisory councils have been constituted. Although initially it was expected that for formulating any policies with respect to the tribals, the advice of Tribal Advisory Council shall be taken. But what happens is that since the influence of Council of Ministers is so immense that it creates problem at Governor and Tribal Advisory Council interface. And more often than not, the Tribal Advisory Council, when it is constituted, it is not a true representative of the tribal population of the state. And apart from that, there is a lack of clarity over the discretionary power of the governor. We know that according to the Constitution of India, the governor is to act on aid and advice of Council of Ministers. But according to the provisions of the 5th schedule, governor can act on its own when it comes to the matters related to the scheduled areas. And so this has led to a lot of confusion, and in essence, the true purpose for which the provisions of the 5th schedule were constituted have not been realized. Then comes the matter of forest rights. We know that most of the tribals in our country reside in forested regions. And it is one of the main reasons for the spread of Naxalism as well. Because since the time of the Britishers, we have started to encroach on forested areas. It started with the British government. The monopolization of forests started with the enactment of various forest laws enacted in order to protect the forest. But in the process, we forgot that forest does not just include the trees and the animals, but also includes people. And since the protection of environment and nature took precedence over the development of the people, there was no Forest Right Acts until 2006, when the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006 was legislated. And through this act, the rights of forest-dwelling tribal communities and other traditional forest dwellers to forest resources and their rights were recognized for the first time. It was recognized that these communities live on forest, depend on forest, and it is very, very important to give them rights inside their own forests. But if you look at the provisions of FRA 2006, Individual right status is decent, but there is minimal community rights, or community rights are not given. There is so much of insistence on evidence. For example, every tribal has to prove through an evidence that they are living in this forest traditionally, and only then their rights will be recognized. And we know that since time immemorial, they have been functioning outside the system which we have created ourselves. And so there is a lack of evidence, which ultimately results in the delay or lack of recognition of the rights provided in Forest Rights Act 2006, which ultimately brews the frustration. Then there are atrocities being committed on scheduled caste and scheduled tribal people. We know that there is an act known by the name of Prevention of Atrocities Against SC and ST Act, but it was again legislated in 1989, but by then this problem had already grown. But even if you look at the implementation of this particular act, it lies in the hands of police officials, which again harbor caste prejudices. Ultimately, people sitting in most powerful positions in the bureaucracy and police also have the same caste biases which this particular act tries to fight. And so, the implementation of this particular act, especially in forested regions, has not been great. And then finally, the lack of land reforms. We know that widespread land reforms were carried out after independence, and it has carried on in some states or the other since then. But the land reforms were successful only in few states, for example in Jammu and Kashmir, Kerala and West Bengal. And due to the lack of the political will, most of the steps categorized under land reforms were either not implemented, or if they were implemented, they were not efficient or effective. And so that left the Indian society, especially in these regions, with a lot of landless people. So they don't have their own forests, they don't have land outside the forest, and so it became quite a fertile ground for an extremist ideology like Naxalism. So what is the current status of left-wing extremism and the activities related to it? So if you look at the data from 2001 to 2018, you can see that there is a persistent decline in the left-wing extremism incidents, which means the attacks being carried out by the Naxalites. As compared to more than 2200 incidents in 2010, it has come down to less than 800 cases in 2018, and this is the data given on the Ministry of Home Affairs. And so it clearly shows that there is some traction to the policies and the strategies being followed by the state governments and also the central governments. So all the states affected by LWE have taken their particular measures to suit their local requirements. But in this particular discussion, we are just going to discuss the approach of the central government and the steps taken by them. At the same time, it is important for you to understand that police and public order being the state subject, action with respect to maintenance of law and order lies primarily in the domain of the concerned state governments. Therefore, the policy of the Government of India is to effectively deal with the LWE insurgency primarily by capacity building of the state governments, both in areas of security and development. So there is a clear-cut demarcation of the policy. The central government helps various state governments as far as security measures is concerned, and then it also helps the state governments in developing the areas on high priority which are impacted with LWE. So you can see that this is quite a holistic approach. And let us start by first understanding the security measures. First and foremost, outlawing the CPI Maoist, which is the major left-wing extremist organization responsible for most incidents of violence and casualties. And it has been included in the schedule of terrorist organization along with all its formations and front organization under the existing Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967 or UAPA. Then, government is taking active measures to strengthen the intelligence mechanism, because central government cannot directly police the areas, but it can provide the intelligence inputs to the states. And so in order to counter the growing challenge of LWE activities, several steps have been taken to strengthen and upgrade the capabilities of intelligence agencies both at the center as well as the state level. This includes intelligence sharing through Multi-Agency Center (MAC) at the central level and State Multi-Agency Center at the state level 24/7 basis. These centers enable state and all India level coordination among various agencies involved in countering the LWE. Other steps which have been taken to strengthen the intelligence mechanism include setting up of joint command and control center at Gaya and at Jagdalpur, which will act as nodal centers to coordinate operation against the CPIM or Naxalites. Then we know that Naxalites take special advantage of the fact that there are limitations in front of the state police, and as soon as you cross the border from one state to another and then from that state to another, you can easily evade the action. And so that is why interstate coordination is a must if you counter LWEs. If you look at the border areas of Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Telangana, which is quite a hotbed for Naxalite activities, this is the main reason. Not only these areas are densely forested, but they also belong to different jurisdictions. And you know that police of one state cannot automatically pursue a criminal in another. And so, taking advantage of this fact, they keep on moving from one state to another. And for this, Ministry of Home Affairs keeps on conducting regular and frequent interstate meetings of not only bureaucrats, police officials, but also the Chief Minister for enabling a better response to LWE. Then we know that majority of casualties to security forces in anti-LWE operations are caused by IEDs or improvised explosive devices. The Ministry of Home Affairs continues to support extensive counter-IED capacity building efforts of state police forces to enable them to timely identify the IEDs and defuse them. And for this purpose, regular training programs are conducted by MHA. Then MHA has created India Reserve or Specialized Indian Reserve Battalion, acronymed as SIRB. The LWE affected states have been sanctioned India Reserve Battalions mainly to strengthen security apparatus at their level and also to enable the states to provide gainful employment to youth, particularly in LWE affected areas. Then there are numerous schemes run by MHA which directly provide advantage to the local police. For example, sanctioning of funds for fortified police stations under the scheme of the same name and carrying out of Civic Action Program or CAP, under which financial grants are provided to CAPFs to undertake various welfare activities in LWE affected areas. And the idea is that CRPF will go to an area, cleanse it from Maoists, keep it free from Maoists, and then develop that area using the same funds. So these are the measures dealing with the security issue. But if we don't develop these areas, these gains will be temporary. And to make these gains permanent, there is a need to develop them as well. And for that also, a lot of schemes are carried out. But in this case, not all schemes are carried out by Ministry of Home Affairs. Now in the beginning we discussed how the acts dealing with the conservation of the forest and the nature created the main problem. And so the Regulation of Forest Conservation Act 1980 have been eased in these areas. And now it is allowed to divert the forest land for infrastructure creation dealing with the activities mentioned in the schedule. For example, construction of schools, colleges, telecommunication lines, drinking water projects, irrigation projects, creation of roads. For all these activities, the limits up to which a forest land can be diverted has been increased drastically to enable the development of these regions. Then, lack of connectivity is the major tool in the hands of Naxalites. They first disconnect the local population from the mainland and then they carry out their brainwashing. And so connectivity has been a major plank of the government of India. And the connectivity does not mean road connectivity only, but it also means communications connectivity. And so the government of India has been implementing road requirement plan and road connectivity project for LWE areas. Also, installation of mobile towers has been on high priority of the government in these regions. Then we talked about how the lack of implementation of the provisions of the Forest Rights Act has created a lot of trouble in these regions. Now government is keeping the timely distribution of the titles or the land titles to the tribals on high priority in LWE areas. According to the recent data by MHA, around 15 lakh titles have been distributed so far, which means that so many people have got the legitimate right to reside inside the forested region. Then we know that various schemes of the government of India, for example, skill development, which is Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and many other schemes dealing with the rural development have a special focus on LWE areas. Similarly, Ministry of Education keeps LWE areas on high priority. For example, recently 7 new Kendriya Vidyalayas and 6 new Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalayas have been opened in LWE affected areas. And you'll be surprised to know that out of these, 2 new Kendriya Vidyalayas are to be opened in Gadchiroli and Kondagaon, which are the epicenter of Naxalism. So this is as far as the steps taken by the central government. But there are various unique schemes being run by various state governments. There are some unique surrender policies being run by various state governments, which has led to rapid increase in the surrender by the Naxalites. Similarly, there are some dedicated police force being created to counter LWE. And so let us know in the comment section what can be some important case studies to be cited while writing an answer in the mains examination. So this discussion is very pertinent from the perspective of GS3 mains examination. And this discussion we understood the idea behind Naxalism, how it originated, what were the deficits in our legal framework which actually gave rise to the Naxalism, and then finally what has been the government approach to counter left-wing extremism. Let us now move on to the next news.